I want to tell you my anecdotes since I lived strange experiences during my work in a pet funeral home. Like there are few in the United States, I prefer to keep everything anonymous. When I started this job, it was during the COVID-19 pandemic as a driver. My job was to go to clients' homes to pick up their pets or take them to the veterinarians. At the beginning, I couldn't handle this job because having pets was a hiring requirement. You can imagine how hard it was. One night, while I was doing my job in a car, just passing by a cemetery, an alert began to sound on the dashboard of the car. It informed me that the passenger seatbelt was unfastened. You might think that I said this to my partner, but the reality is that we always traveled alone in the car. Only I came, 2 dogs, and a cat that I had gone to pick up. When I found a safe, well-lit place, I parked and diagnosed the vehicle with a scanner that we have. Turned out that everything was fine and without faults. I continued my trip, and just when I started the car, the same warning signal sounded again. I tried everything to remove that signal. I hit the passenger seat, moved it, turned it off and on several times, and nothing. Then the only thing I could do was talk. I turned off the music that was playing and said into the air, "Good night. First of all, I am very sorry for whatever happened to you. I know that maybe you want company or have pending matters, and I would like to help you, but I can't. I am an employee of a pet funeral home, and at this moment, I am heading to the crematorium. If you want to join us, we are more than welcome. But if you consider that this is not your place, you can get off at any time you consider appropriate. Good night, and may your trip be peaceful. You will not believe me, but at the next red light that I found, the music turned on by itself, and the passenger seat belt alarm went off. I could not believe what I had experienced. So, the only thing I did was park and rest a few minutes before continuing my trip. On another occasion, during the following month and in the same car, right on the dashboard in the front glove box section of the vehicle, I began to hear knocking sounds. It was as if someone dropped a ball or marble on the floor, and it bounced 3 to 5 times. I did exactly the same thing as before. I parked, diagnosed the car, turned it on and off, and nothing. On that occasion, it was right at noon, and as I was about to leave for my house, I ignored it. I just reported it to my boss. During the next week, I continued to hear those knocking sounds. One Sunday, just as I was going to a service, my girlfriend, now ex-girlfriend, called me. She asked in what area of the city I was going to be and if I could give her a ride or raid, as we say in Mexico. I saw that we coincided, and so I did. She is very spiritual and practices Wiccan arts. So, when she got into the passenger seat, immediately those knocking sounds began to sound right in front of her. I told her what happened, and she told me not to worry. She said it must be the soul of some furry one that had gotten lost and could not get out of the car. Well, I also gave it away ashes. Then, she took out of her bag a kind of glass vial with a very perfumed, transparent oil. She put both hands together as if it were a cream and placed them on the dashboard. While something inside me told me to turn off the music, she began to say a kind of prayer or chant. I don't know what language it was in. It took approximately 5 to 10 minutes like that, and suddenly the car radio turned on by itself. She took her hands off the dashboard and, with a few tears in her eyes, told me that it was over. She said there were more than I thought. Finally, this experience happened to me when I was promoted to cremation technician, and I was in charge of the crematory oven. One day, a curious thing happened since it was at noon or so. I was waiting for a large dog to come out. It may have been an old Belgian Shepherd or a German Shepherd. I only remember that it was a shepherd-type dog. All the little bodies of the pets line up as they arrive to enter one by one. Out of respect for them, I always covered them with a white sheet. Well, while I waited for the shepherd to be ready, I was doing gardening work. When, without any air, the doors of the crematorium that lead to the patio slammed violently. For obvious reasons, I was very scared. When I got to see what had happened, the sheets and the names of the pets were on the floor, as if someone had thrown them. Curiously, my food that I had put in another safe place was also on the floor. I put everything back in its place since, thanks to the processes, we always take photos of what we do. That's how I was able to know what dog it had and what name. I know that these are not the great stories or the scariest ones, but it has been the only job where something like this has happened to me. Today, I am in another company and in a totally different field. In my last months, I fell into the hospital with a severe infection. Fortunately, and thanks to the doctors, I came out walking and without sequelae. A big hug for all those who listen to these stories, and whatever you are facing, you can overcome it. If you're enjoying the video, please subscribe the channel for future videos, and like and share with your friends. This story happened recently in my town. My name is Daniel, and my father has been in charge of the municipal cemetery for more than 20 years. I have always been very familiar with that place because, as a child, I accompanied him while he worked. Although I did not have a direct role in the maintenance, over time, the cemetery became part of my life. Also, at the beginning of this year, problems began to appear that put the tranquility of the town at risk. Someone was desecrating the graves. My father realized one morning when he arrived at the cemetery and found 3 open graves. The strangest thing is that they did not take anything of value. They only removed the bodies. The people of the town began to think that they were witches and that they used the bones for rituals. It was the first time something like that happened. Our town is very small and quiet, and in reality, nobody bothers us. The people are very calm. To face this situation, they hired Alejandro as a night watchman. Alejandro was a childhood friend and one of my best friends. He had always been a calm person, about 20 years old, with a family and children who were still very young. I knew him well because he always arrived early to his shift, and we used to chat for a while before he began his surveillance. One afternoon, around 6 o'clock, I arrived at the cemetery to leave a coffee for my father, and I met Alejandro. He looked very bad, with dark circles under his eyes and a worried expression. He confessed to me that he had been listening to the sounds of shovels digging in different parts of the cemetery for 5 nights. The strangest thing was that each night, the sound came from a different place. He told me that the first time he heard it, he went to investigate. But when he got to where he thought he heard the shovel and the ground, there was no one there, but the ground was disturbed. He explained to me that the sounds always started at dawn. 5 nights went by in which he heard this and went out to see what was happening. Everything stopped, but the strangest thing was that he never found the culprit. The following days, these phenomena stopped happening, and it seemed that everything was going to be normal. I already saw him calmer, but then what I am going to say happened is something very strong and quite delicate. The last time I saw Alejandro was a month ago. I arrived early in the morning to the cemetery because my dad had sent me for some things, and I noticed that something was not right. The guardhouse was open, and his jacket was still hanging on the back of the chair. His thermos of coffee was still warm on the table. His cell phone and his keys were there too, as if he had gone out for a moment and was about to return. But there was no trace of him anywhere. I was alarmed to see that he had not left any note or indication of where he could have gone. I asked my dad if he had seen him, but he told me that no. Everything was very strange. Alejandro never left his things like that. I looked for him everywhere. Hours passed and he did not appear. In the end, we decided to call the police to report his disappearance. Days went by and nobody knew anything about him. His family was desperate. They called in the newspaper to get some news. The police did not have clear answers. They even suggested that maybe he had left of his own free will. But that did not make sense. Why would he leave all his things? Also, his car was still parked outside the cemetery, intact and without signs of having been moved. Later, I spoke with Alejandro's mother, and she told me that the police only gave her the runaround. It seemed like they had already closed the case. She didn't see any movement in the investigation, and that distressed her even more. And now, here I have a theory. At first, I said that nobody pays attention to our town, for better or for worse. But what if what is in the cemetery are not witches, but the cartel? We know of nearby towns where stories of those people begin to be heard. Maybe they have already arrived here too. Maybe Alejandro saw something he shouldn't have or investigated more than he should have and ended up bothering those people. That's why they took him. It's not unusual to hear that these people do some shady things with witchcraft. And if they stole the bones for something like that, the truth is, I don't know what to think. This is getting more and more dangerous. For the moment, my dad has already stopped getting involved in that and now lets them do whatever they want in the cemetery. Yes, it is wrong, but anyway, how do you say no to those people? And if it turns out to be something paranormal too, how do you say no to that? Whatever we are, we're screwed. For now, I hope we find Alejandro. We are very worried about him. That is what has happened so far. I am from Peru, and this is my strange story. This happened to me when I was little back in 2015. I was 13 years old, and we lived in a small town in Pasco, Peru. It was not a very big place, but the particular thing about our house was that it was right next to the cemetery. The truth is that one ends up getting used to living like that. The cemetery was not like those that come out in horror movies. It was a quiet, simple place with graves and flowers. It was always humid because of the climate of the town, and as is normal, you almost never heard anything from there. It all started one night when my parents went to a meeting at my uncle's house. I have never liked parties much. I always get sleepy and bored, so I asked them to stay home. I was already older, and it was not the first time I was alone. I remember it was a normal night. I took a shower, put on my pajamas, and went to my room to watch videos on the computer. It was around 11 at night when everything changed. Suddenly, I heard a scream that froze my blood. It wasn't like those normal screams that you sometimes hear in the street when people are drunk or playing. This scream was different. It was as if someone was suffering a lot. I got up and went to the window. My room looked directly at the cemetery, and from there you could see almost everything. The moon was full that night, so there was quite a bit of light. I looked everywhere, trying to find where the scream came from, but I couldn't see anyone. The strangest thing was that the sound seemed to come from inside the cemetery. I slammed the window shut and ran to the bathroom to hide. I remember I was so scared that my legs were shaking. I wanted to call my parents, but I had left my cell phone on my bed, and there was no way I was going to leave the bathroom. I stayed there, sitting on the floor, hugging my knees, praying that everything would end soon. About 15 minutes passed that seemed like an eternity. The scream stopped. Then, it had already stopped, and everything was silent again. I left the bathroom cautiously and looked out the window again. The cemetery looked the same as always, calm, as if nothing had happened. It was already 2 in the morning, and I was still awake. I couldn't sleep after what had happened, so I started watching my favorite series to distract myself while I waited for my parents to arrive. And that was when everything got much worse. The screams started again, but this time, there were several. It was as if there were a lot of people screaming at the same time. They were screams of pain, of agony, as if they were torturing someone. I stood up again and approached the window. And this time, I know it's hard to believe, but I swear that's how I saw it. There was a section of the cemetery that seemed to be on fire. They weren't normal flames. It was like a weird fire, as if the graves were burning inside. And among the flames, you could see shadows, black figures that writhed and screamed. They moved as if they had no bones. I was paralyzed, looking at that scene for a few seconds. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. This time, I grabbed my cell phone before running to the bathroom. I locked myself in and called my parents, crying. I told them to come quickly, that something very bad was happening in the cemetery. 5 minutes later, the screams stopped suddenly. When my parents arrived minutes later, everything was normal again. I told them what had happened, but they didn't believe me. They told me that I was probably tired, that it had been my imagination, or that I had fallen asleep watching TV. But I know what I saw. It's not that I was asleep or imagining things. Everything was real. A few months later, we moved to Lima for my dad's job. I never went back to that town, and the truth is, I don't want to go back. My dad told me this story. It's about one of his closest friends, Gilberto. Gilberto started working as a night watchman at the municipal cemetery. The truth is, I wouldn't dare do that job even if they paid me double. But everyone has their reasons. Gilberto and my dad go out for drinks every week. That's where I heard this story in detail. Gilberto had only been on the job for about a month. One night, around 7 p.m., He was following his usual routine. Suddenly, he saw something. It was a man standing in front of a grave. The strange thing was that this man was very tall, over 6 feet. That caught a lot of attention because the older folks in our town, and I guess in most places, tend to be shorter than that. He was wearing a very long trench coat. Gilberto approached to tell him it was time to leave. The man turned to look at him, nodded, and began walking slowly towards the exit. Gilberto watched him for a moment, thinking maybe it was a relative who had stayed late. He continued on his rounds, checking that no one else was left. Gilberto and his partner, Saul, had a system. They wrote down in a notebook the description of each person who left. It was a security measure they always followed. When Gilberto returned to the entrance, Saul was there. They checked their notebooks, making sure everyone had left. Even the tall man, who was unmistakable, was noted. They were about to close when Saul looked into the distance, at a point between the graves, and told Gilberto to look. Gilberto turned and felt a knot in his stomach. There was the same tall man, standing exactly where he had seen him before. He didn't think about supernatural things. He just thought it was a mistake. Maybe the man got lost or something. But that didn't make sense either because Saul had seen him leave. They didn't give it much importance this time. Both approached him again to tell him to leave. The man nodded again and began walking. They escorted him to the entrance to make sure he really left. Gilberto had a strange feeling that maybe someone else did the same thing as the tall man and was still inside. So he offered to make one last round while Saul went ahead to his house. There are many trees in the cemetery, and also some tombs and mausoleums that are very high. They cost a lot to maintain, but they make sure everything is secure. Gilberto checked every corner, making sure no one was still there. Minutes passed, and then he saw it again. In the distance, the tall figure of the man with the trench coat was clearly visible. At that moment, Gilberto understood that whatever that thing was, it wasn't alive, at least not in the usual sense. So he didn't even try to tell it to go away. Instead, he turned around and began walking as fast as he could towards the exit. He didn't run because he was afraid that if he did, he would make noise and that thing would chase him. When he finally reached the entrance, he locked it and left without turning around even once. The next day, Gilberto told Saul everything he had experienced the night before. Together, they checked the area where they had seen the man, but they didn't find anything strange. I asked my dad to ask Gilberto if he had seen the tall man again. Apparently, he hasn't. No more strange things have happened since then.